Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new webinar of the 9-month non-university series for this academic year 2025-2026. My name is Géraldine Lyon. I'm an international project assistant at the University of Graz, and I will be hosting today's webinar. Before we start the webinar, I will give you a bit of context about the ARCUS European University Alliance. This is an alliance which brings together 9 institutions. The 9 institutions share academic, scientific, and cultural objectives. They have a common vision of the role of higher education and research and mutual fields of interest. This webinar is part of the Plurilingual and Intercultural Hub. The Hub promotes multilingualism by using the language skills of students, researchers, and staff, and also developing intercultural competence. The lecture focus on specific topics related to language and culture and are intended to generate awareness and appreciation for the topic of multilingualism and an understanding of the many areas of our lives that are related to and influenced by language. Now I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Professor Christian Stalzer. Professor Stalzer studied linguistics at the University of Graz and has been working in the Department of Translation Studies since 1995, in which he is responsible now for the Sign Language Division. He teaches Austrian Sign Language translation and interpreting at bachelor and master level. His research interests include sign language grammar, deaf studies, and didactics. He has also been involved in several research projects related to Austrian Sign Language and deaf studies, as well as in the development of further training courses for sign language teachers and interpreters. The title of today's session is Beyond Words: What Sign Languages Teach Us About Multilingualism, Identity, and Human Communication. During this presentation, he will explore why sign languages must be included in discussion about multilingualism. Why are they essential for discussion on inclusion, teaching, and higher education? Using the University of Graz as an example, the presentation will show why a broader understanding of language and diversity is particularly important in the European higher education context. Today, Christian is accompanied by Antonia Meyer and Tiana Jerkovic for interpreting. Before I give the screen to Christian, I would like to remind the audience that they can leave comments and questions on the comment box, and that at the end of the webinar, I will pass them to Christian so he can answer. So thank you for being with us, Christian, and I'm very pleased to give you the floor for the presentation.
Many thanks, dear Geraldine, for the introduction and a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be presenting here today in this webinar series. I'm very thankful also to have the 2 interpreters with me today, Antonia Meyer and Tiana Jerkovic, which without them we couldn't be doing this webinar. You wouldn't be able to understand me. And same the other way around, I wouldn't be able to understand the questions that you might have later. So I'm very happy to have the 2 of them today with me and to be presenting with them as a team. I am signing in my national sign language, which is Austrian Sign Language, abbreviated OGS. And the 2 interpreters are interpreting into English spoken language, which is quite respectable. So also the other way around, they're interpreting the questions that may be asked in English into Austrian Sign Language. So about multilingualism, when we speak about multilingualism in Europe, oftentimes you think about national spoken languages, you think about foreign language competencies, you think about travel internationally, you think about internationalization, you think about cultural exchange, which is of course really important, but it's not sufficient because sign languages in these equations are mostly overlooked because it's only focused on languages that are vocal or auditory. So signed languages are organized spatially and have different modalities. And for sign languages, it is very important that there are not only the hands that are tools to communicate, it's also facial expressions, it's gaze, it's head and body movements, and it's the signing space. So today I am presenting not only as a researcher, but I'm also presenting from my own lived experience as a deaf person. And so this means the topics that I'm talking to you about today is not something that is abstract for me. It's something that I have lived from my kindergarten to my school life and also through university. So the perspective that I bring on multilingualism is something that is not only focused on spoken languages, but also on signed languages, on different communication forms, on social expectation, on cultural exchange, and on different institutions. Okay, let me just fix my frame. Thank you for letting me know to the interpreter. Of course, it is important to see my full signing, so we're all good to go. All right, so multilingualism is something that is not neutral. Maybe you are wondering what I mean by that. Of course, multilingualism is coined or is maybe thought about open, progressive, and a positive term representing diversity, representing travel, representing European community. And of course, in many European or EU documents, multilingualism is seen as a chance, as a resource for integration, for inclusion, for competition. But it is also not just only a friendly term, it's a quite normative term. Let me explain what I mean by that. Each society decides which languages are visible, which languages are seen as valuable, which languages are secured institutionally, and also which languages might stay under the radar a little bit. And for signed languages, this is often the case. So it is not something that is neutral, multilingualism. There are many scientists or researchers that say that language ideologies decide which language gets seen as modern, as valuable, which language are maybe not visible. And these languages that are not visible, that's often the case for sign languages. And that's also something that I experienced many times. For example, when you talk about multilingualism, you maybe think quick about German and English, you think about Spanish and French, you think about Italian and Danish. But when I might throw OGS, Austrian Sign Language, into the equation, oftentimes the reaction is, oh, that's also a language, that counts, that's interesting. And that's already a proof that focus of multilingualism is still kind of on spoken languages. So the issue is not that multilingualism is thought wrong, but in my perspective, it's a narrow understanding, and it's only focused on spoken languages, maybe a multitude of spoken languages that exist at the same time, but signed languages are actually forgotten. So why is it the case that signed languages are often overlooked? that is tightly tied to history and historical developments. For sign language, for example, in the university sector and higher education, it is quite not that accessible for people to access education in sign language. And that goes back to a moment in time in 1880 at the Milan Congress, where that was quite a tough time that had quite the repercussions for the deaf community. Because at the Milan Congress in 1880, it was decided that sign languages are banned for deaf education, so forbidden for teaching deaf and hard of hearing children. So when you think about this decision, which was made by hearing people for the deaf community to forbid them their language or forbid our language, and that is something that is still tangible and visible today, and we still feel the repercussions from that decision, which can't be forgotten. So as a teaching language or a language with which you can have access to research, to the academic world, this was not possible for us. And it's not only a disadvantage for individual people, but it was actually a whole community that was discriminated. So we see that people in the deaf community might not have high school diplomas, they don't have a wide choice of career options, and they don't have the self-determination. And I can draw from my own experience. When I was in kindergarten as a kid, I was not allowed to use sign language. Well, bad luck for me. But of course, it wasn't possible for us to talk to other deaf kids with our voices. Of course, we were signing, but if we got caught in that, then there were punishments, verbally, physically. So I was pulled by my hair. I had to hold my hands on the table, and I was smacked with a ruler. So that was a lot of experiences that the deaf community made. It wasn't allowed to use a sign language. And of course, there wasn't a possibility of interpreters. The teaching staff didn't know how to interact with deaf students, didn't have empathy. So of course, during my whole course of my studies, of my school time, I was just sitting in class and I didn't understand anything. And if I might wanted to ask a question, I was mocked, I was looked at funny because I was just that deaf kid. So I just stayed there alone, silent. I didn't ask anything. And that's not only me, that's many other deaf people that made the same experience.
So now you might be hearing a different voice, but it's still me, Christian, who is doing the lecture, of course. So there are a lot of deaf people who, for example, are going to different institutions or are at different places. And usually different institutions just see deaf people as persons with disabilities. We also just say we are deaf. This is mainly the term that we use. But there are also other persons, or the old term, which I would say deaf and dumb, which is negatively connotated. So we should not use this term, but deaf is perfectly fine. And it's very important to see that we have a lot of different, we are fighting for our rights, and it is very important to fight for the rights of access. And we do have a lot of things that have already been recognized, And we do have a lot of technical aids where the cost is being covered. And for example, employers can also have the possibility to get compensation for any additional costs that they might have. But I also want to say that we as deaf people, for example, of course, there are still a lot of barriers because of the deafness. But I wouldn't say that we are disabled. I would say that we are being disabled by society, because we are getting all these barriers from the outside, because there is a structure and a system that just isn't thinking about this group, that is just overlooking this whole group. And this is why we have these barriers, and this is my reality. So if you think about deaf people and you have this perspective of seeing them as people with disabilities, then it's also very easy to just see a stigma and just see them as people who need any kind of aids, or just who do not have very good spoken language, and sign language is just seen as a support system. But if you see ourselves as a language and linguistic minority and cultural minority, you see that we have our own culture and traditions and norms and our own identities. And if you see ourselves like that, like a linguistic minority, you can see that we have, of course, also language rights, and that it is important to fight for these language rights and to fight for access to language. But of course, at the same time, it is very challenging to see both of these dimensions, to see us as people with disabilities, where we also get, of course, sometimes support that we need, but to also be able to see us as a linguistic minority where we get the access to language. That is very challenging to see both of these dimensions and to see this duality, but we need both of them. So one very important term, of course, is inclusion, but what I see as more important is access to language. And in the general discussion, if you talk about access to language and inclusion, it's of course also important to talk about participation and everything. And these are very important terms. But for me, from a research perspective, I say that this is insufficient. Of course, we have all these barriers, but it is also more important for us to see where we have access to language. And this is also connected to language deprivation. There are a lot of researchers who have proven that if children, deaf children, do not have actually a risk because of the deafness, but the problem is that if they get access to sign language too late or too limited access, then there are a lot of risk factors happening. For example, they will have trouble following in school, they will have trouble building knowledge, and it is very important to see that it is because of the access to language. One example, we have a deaf child who is attending kindergarten or school, and no one is signing. That is already a language deprivation, because the child has no natural language that it can follow, no access to language. And so we need to support the child, but mainly the support is only happening in spoken language environments. Only the usage of spoken language is encouraged, and sign languages are systematically driven out. And the problem with that is that this is also language deprivation. And for me, this is quite sad, of course, because there are also a lot of parents who don't have the information, who have no access to this information. They get maybe the diagnosis, okay, my child is deaf, and then they only get the medical information, and they get the information about how to have the surgery for a cochlear implant, for example, but they don't receive any information on sign language and on the benefits of sign language and access to sign language. This is oftentimes ignored, and parents just don't receive that information. So we need to raise more awareness also for parents. So of course I could tell a lot of these things also from my personal experience. But when I also talk to other students and colleagues, for example, you can see that, for example, or when I was in school, I could not understand everything, of course. I could only understand information on the surface level. I could only understand maybe half of what was said because it was all in spoken language. But for me, when I was in the deaf community, in situations where people were signing, when I was together with deaf people, then there were no language barriers. We were all signing, I could ask questions. And for me, for example, also at home, that was very lucky for me because I have a deaf family and we had no language barriers at home. But as soon as I went outside, all these barriers were coming up because of the language barriers of the spoken language. So for me, it is very important that access to language is something that we see as a chance, and we don't have to see it as a deficit, so that we don't see deaf people as persons who don't have this access. But it's important to shift the perspective that deafness is also positive and sign language is also positive. So for me, it's not about what a deaf child cannot hear, but the main question is, how can we ensure access to a language that is easily accessible to these children? And when and how can we ensure this access? This is what I want to look at, and this is what I want to emphasize. And because these are all the things that are very heavily a problem within the structure, but these structural problems have a lot of consequences, because if you don't have the access early enough, then you will get a lot of consequences, for example, in terms of cognition or in social participation and so on. But I also have a different question. And it's of course a matter of rights, and we have the UNCRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, who is actually obligating us to think more about this and to support children. And if we think about the rights, it is of course very important to be mindful of the UNCRPD and I know this is a very long term with Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but they have very clear articles and very clear obligations. For example, Article 24 is actually obligating countries that they have to ensure that sign languages are also promoted in school, that also in the deaf community, that the identity of deaf people is protected and that sign languages are protected. And that also it is important that countries have to ensure language rights and that sign language offers are available. So that is very important, especially for children, that they get access to sign language. And it's not only important to think about this in school, but also in higher education or tertiary education, because we have to ensure that the chances are there for deaf people to also enter university.
So language access is not something that is a bonus that we do of goodwill. It is actually a binding human right. It's an obligation. And it's quite interesting that different European countries have different approaches. There are different, of course, structures in place. For example, the European Union of the Deaf, or the ECML, the European Center for Modern Languages, which the two institutions have been fighting for representation of sign languages for quite some time. And many countries in the European Union have already recognized their national sign languages. As for us in Austria, Austrian Sign Language was recognized legally in 2005, which is also my national sign language. But the problem is that it's not just done with legal recognition, it also has to be lived. So the legal recognition does not add up to the reality. I want to give you one more example. So in everyday life, when I might need an interpreter for a meeting, it's not just as easy that I book it and an interpreter comes to my meeting. I have to file a submission, I have to file a justification, I have to wait. And then, of course, the authorities, they might accept my submission or my application if I'm lucky, so my access is granted. But sometimes they don't, and then I stand in front of closed doors and in front of a barrier. And I do wonder if that is fair, that my inclusion, my participation is so conditional and is so dependent on a form and if it gets accepted or not. So that decides if I am in or out. But that is actually reality. But I do not always want to compliment on the Scandinavian countries, but I know that when you compare European countries, that they are advanced in some matters, and I want to give one example. In Sweden, there is a law that clearly states when hearing parents give birth to a deaf baby, they immediately get 2 weeks of paid leave, paid work leave, and they immediately get access to a free sign language class to learn Swedish Sign Language to communicate with their deaf child. So that is just something that is happening in Sweden. But in Austria, we are far from that. So that's not even a discussion about that. Of course, there are differences. It depends on the countries if the sign language is recognized or not, if the laws are in place or not. But concerning these things, I want to bring up another term, which is audism, which is a concept that states that hearing or communication forms of the hearing are superior, are more natural, are more present, and visual communication is seen as inferior. And there's a researcher, the one who coined this term, it's Harlan Lane from the United States, a linguist who has done some research on this discrimination form called audism. There's, of course, a lot of scientific proof that deaf people live and feel these barriers every day. And this is actually quite true for the deaf community. I want to give some examples of what audism means. For example, for children, when they are only promoted to wear hearing aids, to maybe get a cochlear implant, to use spoken language and to not use sign language, maybe if everything goes south and the last resort might then be the access to a signed language. But I think that is quite sad. It's quite ironic. If you think that oftentimes there are publications that say it's really recommended for babies, hearing babies, to learn some signs because there's a clear proof that scientific proof that it doesn't matter if a baby is deaf or hearing, that you communicate with sign language earlier than spoken language. So there are some baby gestures that babies can already learn before they even use their vocal or speak verbally. So it's quite ironic that hearing babies get more access to sign language than deaf babies or deaf children do. And that is quite shocking. And that is also something that is audist or autism. And most of the times in schools or in universities, that is structured or built for the hearing world and built for people that communicate verbally. And sign languages maybe are an afterthought or added additionally at the end, but not quite at the same level. So autism is not always a conscious process. Sometimes it might be, which I have seen or experienced as well, when I want to sign in an environment, then other people tell me, no, we don't sign here, we do it the normal way, we speak. So that might be a form of conscious autism. But there are also instances of unconscious acts of autism that might be just speaking over each other while there is a deaf person present. So of course this is not legible to them, or there's many different forms of unconscious autism. And of course for hearing people, it's a routine, it's normal, it's not something they do consciously, but for us deaf people, it is actually exclusion. And it might, the same for me when I file an application for provision of interpreter, it gets declined again and again and again, I might give up. And that is something that I want to fight against, because we as the deaf community, we should not give up. And something that we should not forget also as the deaf community is intersectionality. I hope my internet connection is working. Sorry, just checking with the interpreters. I need, of course, the internet connection. I need that I see the interpreters, but I think it's working fine. Let me go back. I want to also bring up intersectionality as a concept, because oftentimes people see the deaf community as something that is homogeneous, or there's the one type of deaf person, but that is of course not true. The deaf community has many varieties, and of course not only on a European level, but internationally, we're not all the same. We're not a homogeneous group. There's not that one type of deaf person. There's of course intersectionality that might also sometimes get overlooked. There is of course deaf people with different genders, from different ethnicities, with different social status or situations, with different sexual orientations, with different migration backgrounds. So there's quite the big diversity in the deaf community, but oftentimes when you look at statistics, you only might see the English term people with hearing loss. So that's that one box kind of you get put in, a medical box, also a medical perspective, but it is quite forgotten that there are sign languages, there are different identities, there is a linguistic minority, a cultural minority, and that is oftentimes overlooked.
So you have to acknowledge that the deaf community has a lot of diversities as well. And we have also deaf BIPOC, people with different migration histories, and also queer deaf people, of course. And these are very diverse people, and they often are overlooked, of course, as well. So I want to also raise awareness about this, and so that we can't say there's just one deaf person, but there might be deaf persons who are also suffering from racism or sexism or other forms of discrimination. And it is important that we think of them as the deaf community as well, and that we are aware that they don't only face one barrier, but they have multiple barriers that they have to overcome. And that is very, very difficult as well. So I think it is very important that if we say inclusion and we have this term, that's okay, but it is insufficient. We have to think about participation and think about if there are structures for inclusion, who are they for actually, and really to see and look, what inclusion is for and who it is for. So I want to also talk about two other terms, deafhood and deaf gain. These are also very important. And it's, for me, important to ignore or to go away from the deficit model and to try to shift the perspective to a more positive view. And for me, for example, in my experience as a deaf person, I don't want to see it that I was lacking a lot of things or that it was deficient. But I want to say with the terms of deafhood and deaf gain that I am proud also to be deaf, and I'm proud of my sign language. So deafhood, for example, focuses very heavily on the deafness, but not in terms of the medical perspective, not focusing on the ear and the deficit and what we are lacking, but more on our sign language and our culture and history, and that we are proud of that as a community. And something else that is very important that I want to say is that maybe some of you are already aware about is this people first language. So that we say people with disability or people with disabilities, for example. I think this is also very good. It deserves respect because it puts the person in the first place. But for deaf people, it doesn't always work that well. Because for me, for example, person with hearing loss or person with hearing disability, it would mean that I am only characterized by this one disability, but this is not who I am, of course. I am proud of my culture, my sign language, and I'm proud to be a deaf person. But a lot of people, they are just wondering about that. They might not always understand that. But I think this is also important to show that we can say, I am a deaf person, and this is totally fine. I don't need to have person with disability or something. But as I said before, the only thing that should really be avoided is deaf and dumb, as a very old and negative term, of course. So the first thing is that we are proud of our culture. Of course, we have deafhood and we also have deaf gain. And this concept is very interesting because it takes the concept of deafhood one step further. The concept sees deaf persons as not as someone who is losing something or is lacking something, because that is not true. And also not only that we are proud of something, but that we are also able to give our benefits to the hearing community, for example, that also other people have some kind of gain and that we also have benefits from this disability, but because of our sign language and our culture, we have a lot of advantages that we can also use and that we can also share with other people. And one example is, for example, also one movement that is happening also within Europe. And deaf gain is this movement that is shifting the perspective away from the negative deficit model away to a more positive notion of deafness. So if you see deafhood and deaf gain, these terms are also very important and very good. But for example, we also have another term, which is sourd. And this is a new term. It's a word creation. and it takes the first word from su, which is the Spanish you or your, and ma from the French, which means hand. And so it focuses on the hands as a communication tool. And it, again, reframes deafness and as not being something that we are lacking. We are not having a hearing loss, but we are having the gain of our hands as a communication tool. And this is also a very interesting movement, a very interesting new term that is being used in parts of the deaf community. And so for me, language and culture and community, these are the important things. I'm a human who is part of this community. And of course, hearing people have a lot of norms that are special for them, and that might pose barriers for us. And this should not be forgotten. And if we now combine this with higher education sectors, there are still a lot of barriers, of course. And the situation is getting better compared to a few years ago. There's been a lot of improvement. And higher education sectors also focus a lot on multilingualism as well. For example, on German, English, Italian, but only on spoken languages. There might be sometimes offers in sign languages or also sign language interpreters, but this is only at some occasions and not taken for granted. But this is also a structural problem, of course, and connected to the structure and to the system. And for example, we also have a service in Austria, which is called GESTU. It is a service center whose name stands for Successful Studying for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Students. And they offer support for deaf students to, for example, find interpreters or also do transcripts for teaching materials. And this is a very important service for the higher education sector. And we now also have the service in Graz since 2023, who also works for Graz and Klagenfurt, so for two cities at once. And this is very important for the higher education sector. But the general system still stays spoken language oriented, of course, because teaching materials are not always visually accessible. PowerPoint slides heavily rely on text. And of course, if we have an interpreter also at lectures, the lectures are still in spoken language and very fast, and also the discussions are at a very fast pace. So for me, as a deaf person in this environment, there are a lot of consequences. Because even if I have a sign language interpreter, which is a very important support, it's not possible for me to look at the slides and read the slides at the same time while looking at the interpreter, and the other way around. If I look at the interpreter, I can't look at the slides at the same time. So for me as a deaf person, this is not as accessible as for hearing persons who have the advantage to be able to listen and take notes and also read at the same time. So we'll have interpreter.
So for the students, deaf students, that is also quite the challenge, because it's not possible for them to take notes while watching a lecture, while hearing students comfortably listen to the lecture, watch the slides, and take notes at the same time. So that's just still, again, some barriers that exist, because the support system with interpretation provision is in place, but the structure, the system still operates very hearing-centric, and that still leaves the barrier there. So I also want to give an example of what structures are in place in Graz. I don't want to keep too much on the negative side. I also want to maybe give some positive examples of things that we already attained, that we already succeeded in. My department at the University of Graz, the Department for applied and theoretical translation studies, I'm really proud to say that we have our curriculum of sign language interpretation on a master level, same as the two interpreters that are interpreting today had the possibility to participate in, and they made this on a master level. So I'm really proud that I was able, or that we were able, together with Professor Nadia Gribic and Karin Hofstetter, to actually set up this curriculum. It's also thanks to Dr. Brunsch, who was able to start this degree of sign language interpretation at the University of Graz. And that was goes back to 1999, when the first group actually started their studies. But there were still some structural happenings, and in 2002 it was actually the first time that this degree took place. And this is quite an achievement, and I want to add that we are the only institution in the country of Austria that offers a degree on a graduate level for sign language interpretation. While we are working as a team consisting of hearing and deaf lecturers, which is quite nice, and I'm quite proud to say that it's not something where sign language is offered as a plus or as a bonus, but it is a full language, fully accessible in sign language on a university level, and it's also at the same level as other spoken languages, taught at the same level, which I think is really important and sends a really good message. But of course, there are also some other possibilities to study sign language interpretation in Austria, which I don't want to leave unmentioned, but these are happening on different institutional frames. Of course, these positive examples that I just mentioned, they're not enough, because we still need the whole system to change, as I already explained during the course of my lecture. So that is the important part, that we don't just add sign languages, as I said, as an afterthought, or that we have some structures, but it's really important that the whole system can live through a change. I know I'm already kind of at the end of my time, so I want to come to the conclusion. I want to end by saying that there are many institutions, documents that fight for the rights of sign languages, the UNCRPD that was mentioned, the European Union of the Deaf, EUD, the ECML, the Austrian National Deaf Association, the Federal Deaf Associations, the Interpreting Association of Austria, ÖGSTV. So there are many institutions that fight for the diversity of languages and multilingualism. And I want to also add that we are happy to say that the situation for sign languages is better than compared it was 20, 30 years ago. But I also want to say that on a European level, the big decisions, they're not only made in Brussels or in Strasbourg, they're also made in their member countries, in ministries, in schools, in universities, in hospitals, and also in authorities. So it's really important that these decisions and these institutions also think about multilingualism this way. So also for social governance, it is important that we change the things little by little. Of course, it's also a budget situation, or not always easy, But I want to close by saying that when the system changes in a positive way, that it also has positive consequences for the whole society. So let me end by saying that sign languages are not just a special case or something that is added later on. Sign languages are actually a big part of the European linguistic landscape and of multilingualism. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much for the three of you, and Christian, of course. It was very, very interesting. And, like the goal of those webinars are to raise awareness. And I think like you actually reached that point. And personally, I think that sometimes from a hearing people perspective, we don't have all those barriers in mind that deaf persons can actually cross along their career and even in the kindergarten, as you were saying that very well. And I was thinking myself that we should maybe have already sign languages taught like from the very start, like at kindergarten and primary school. It would be like really something changing everything. So that was my personal comment on the presentation. It was very, very nice. I'm just looking if we have comments written. No, thank you. So I have a question.
My pleasure.
Because yes, as I was saying, maybe we have some like a non-knowledge of sign language. So what do you think that people should know about sign language?
For me, it's important that there's a change in attitude, which is maybe not easily done. As I said before, sign languages are often not visible, are often overlooked, are maybe hidden. And when you walk outside as a deaf person, you're not recognized as a deaf person until you start signing. So, and then maybe people realize that there's a deaf person under them. Also, I think it should be more visible in general and more represented in society. And I see that there is a change of attitude needed, that sign languages are, of course, have their own grammar, which is different from the spoken language grammar. And what I also want to add is that because as deaf people, we need sign languages, and I want to have more respect, more curiosity, more acceptance in the hearing society. So when I also want the hearing society to see and know that it's also a benefit for them to have sign languages, and then for them to learn sign languages.
And so that the hearing community also recognizes that this is an advantage for them as well, because you use your whole body and facial expressions and everything. And this is something that is very creative and very natural. And also you really train your visual competences, actually. You gain a broader field of view, you recognize spatial things. If you walk into a room, you can see more things, actually. And also in everyday life, it can be very advantageous. For example, if I am at a disco, if I'm out partying, for example, and it's very, very loud because of the music, and usually you wouldn't understand each other with spoken language. But if I'm signing, we could just be dancing and signing at the same time. Or, for example, if I'm inside of a room where it's supposed to be quiet, for example, at a library, I can just use sign language to communicate in a silent way without bothering anyone else. So these are also advantages in general in everyday life because of sign language. And also, for example, in TV or in the media, I would also say that in current times, it's much better because we also have Austrian news, for example, with sign language interpretation. That is also a huge step forward. But we don't have a lot of it's only all showed in a secondary channel. It's not in a live television at the regular TV program. So the problem is that we actually have to check this other special channel in the program if there is sign language interpretation or not. So it's not visible for the regular TV program, and hearing people don't realize that the service is there. So that should be more visible. But I know the problem is also sometimes that, yeah, I don't know, some people might not accept this all the time. And also, I don't want to say that all hearing people are the same. Of course, you can't say it. There are a lot of different hearing people as well. And the same is happening with deaf people. Of course, we are also all not the same. But a lot of hearing people say that, for example, also in terms of subtitles, or if there is an interpreter, they think that this is distracting and that it is the visual extra things are distracting from the main event, kind of. And this is also very sad and, yeah, just something that a lot of hearing people say, which is quite a shame. And maybe another thing that I'm thinking of right now is I would actually wish that oftentimes in some situations, this does not happen to me a lot, but I'm talking for the deaf community in general. I would wish that if there is a situation where a deaf person is, for example, hearing people would just say, oh, the deaf person, it's just so sad. But you don't have to see it that way. So we are deaf persons, but we are fine. We are not suffering from anything really in particular. Yes, we have these barriers, but we do have a lot of other possibilities, and we have a lot of possibilities of what we can do. And this is very, very beautiful. And we are generally we have a very positive attitude. And maybe in the hearing community, if you see us like that, don't think about the negative aspects. Just see that, okay, we are deaf people, but we also have this deaf gain and a lot of advantages and possibilities as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that, yes, usually we see the dark side of the things and not the bright side of them. So that's a very good point to say that. And I have a last question. I think we still have 1 or 2 minutes if you can, because sometimes we may misunderstand like the deaf people and the sign language. So what is the common misunderstanding between deaf people and sign languages?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part?
Yeah, what is the common misunderstanding that we can have between deaf people and sign languages? So I would say that the most common misunderstanding is that every deaf person can lip read perfectly. That is not the case, of course. So yes, some deaf people can lip read, or they also have a very good competences in lip reading, but other deaf people just can't. It is very, very hard for them. And some also don't want to do lip reading. And that is also fine, because it's within everyone's competences to see if they are able to do it or not, if they want to do it or not. So, and for me, it is still challenging as well. And it's very difficult to explain it now in German, because in our Austrian Sign Language, because it's German words, and I know it's being interpreted into English, but there are some words that applies for English as well that sound different, but
the mouthing is the same. The mouth movement is the same. So I can't see the differences between B and M, for example. It's just the same, or E and I, or different things, vocals and consonants. And because there are also a lot of sounds that are being made in the back of the mouth, you just can't see that. For example, G or that is very, very difficult, or L, which are formed at the back, and you can't see that with lip reading. So, for example, for deaf people, lip reading is really, really challenging, and you have to think about all the context. You have to think about, okay, what could this be about? And then maybe you are able to understand everything. This is the first part, the first misunderstanding, or the first part of the lip reading challenge, because we also have a lot of English words in German, and these are almost impossible to lip read. So if it's written for me, for example, I would understand it, but in lip reading, if there are some English words, that is very, very difficult. Or also French, for example, generally also spoken languages are very different in terms of lip reading. French is very hard to understand through lip reading, and German is also quite difficult, but for me a bit easier. But yeah, this is one misunderstanding. And a second misunderstanding, maybe it doesn't happen that often, but I would also like to mention it, is that it's kind of an misunderstanding, misconception that all of us have technical aids like hearing aids or cochlear implants, and that they would actually ensure perfect hearing, as if technical aids as hearing aids and cochlear implants ensure that we could be part of the hearing community equal to other hearing people, which is not the case, because as soon as we take off the cochlear implant or the hearing aid, we are still deaf, and we are still deaf persons. So the deafness still stays. And this is also very connected to identity. And if you think about identity, this is very important. If you have a child with a cochlear implant, they have to accept that, okay, I am deaf and this is part of my identity, and maybe I want to use sign language. But then on the other side, there are people who have cochlear implants and hearing aids and feel like, oh, but I wouldn't identify as deaf. I want to be part of the hearing community. And that is also fine, because it is an individual decision that everyone has to make. And we should not be influencing people to become part of one or the other community, but it should be a free decision of everyone. And the third misunderstanding is that also sometimes happen, is that sign language is international, which is also not the case. Every country has their own sign language, own national sign language. We have LSF, Langue de Signes Française, for French, for example. We have German Sign Language that is different to Austrian Sign Language, and so on. We have BSL, British Sign Language, and also we have something similar maybe to spoken language, which is similar to spoken languages. We also have dialects and regional dialects within the countries as well. So this is something that also a lot of people don't know about, but which I also find very interesting.
Yeah, it is, and actually, like, this was something like I understood when I was presenting the webinar and preparing it, that you were signing in Austrian Sign Language, which means that we have plenty of other sign languages, and that it's different, of course, and it's a language on its own. So yeah, it was very, very interesting. Thank you so much for the three of you for this webinar. And yeah, I don't know if you want to say a last word, or
sorry.
Yeah, if you want to add something, but it was a very nice topic. And
yes. Thank you so much. Also, I want to thank the interpreters again for working together so smoothly. I want to thank you for the invitation, and I hope that it was interesting for the viewers today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.